With Paul Pontallier of Château Margaux and just discussing the 2014 vintage, Paul, if you were asked what were the particular characteristics of your 14, what would they be?
I think 14 is, for me, a great classical Bordeaux, and in that sense that it has a very high concentration, a high level of density, but also quite soft tannins and a lot of freshness. So all that was provided by the late season, of course. So it makes 14, I think, probably not one of the most outstanding years, but certainly just below that. At least a very good, maybe a great vintage, and a great classical one.
You came out with that wonderful line earlier on this morning, saying that it is perhaps the greatest of the lesser vintages, which is, or indeed, the least of the best vintages, which is a very...
Yeah, sure. No, would take a bit long to explain the whole thing, but I think definitely that 14 is, yes, it is definitely the best of all the vintages from the 21st century, which are not the most outstanding ones, and among the most outstanding, of course, there are 2000, 2003, 05, 09, and 10. Those vintages, especially 05, 09, and 10, are just unbelievable. They might never have been made before. And 14 is obviously underneath those ones, but above everything else which had been done in the 21st century.
You talked earlier about some of the difficulties in the growing season and also some of the great opportunities in the growing season. What do you think was the single biggest challenge for you in 2014?
I don't think there was as many challenges as we got in 13 or in a few other vintages. We just were, I mean, spring went very well, summer was average. Of course, we would have hoped a brilliant summer. It wasn't, but it was average. We just missed that the drought in August, which we always have in the greatest vintages. But there was not a real challenge. And then wonderful weather started late August until the end of the harvest. So it was rather easy vintage. Of course, the usual small problems in the vineyards, but there wasn't a real challenge, just the fact that we had the impression to miss a truly superb vintage. But is it a challenge? It's just some disappointment at that level.
You talked about 2013. For us, and I suspect for most in the UK trade and even the world trade of wine, it was the worst en primeur campaign in certainly in our history. Why do you think that was?
Well, first of all, I think if we concentrate on Château Margaux and the first growth, I think the campaign went reasonably well. Now, if we extend that to Bordeaux as a whole, yeah, it makes sense because 13 is one of the weakest vintages, and of course, as soon as you go down the ladder of classification and quality, 13 was a very difficult vintage. It's probably the most challenging, and in some conditions, the worst vintage of the 21st century. So when people pretend selling wines en primeur like this, it's complicated. I mean, it only works for the very, very best wines. So in such a vintage, the en primeur, the success, if I may say so, is limited to a handful of wines. Mm.
So do you think that in market terms, pushing aside qualitative terms, because we know that 13 and 14 are wildly different in quality, happily, but do you think in market terms that Bordeaux and the consumer have learnt any lessons from 13 or indeed 12 or 11? In other words, that's perhaps a complicated way of saying, how do you think 14 ought to be presented, ought to be priced, ought to be offered to the consumer?
No, I think it's always the same principles which should apply, that people buy en primeur because they know that if they buy later, they will pay a higher price. If it's not the case, there is no good reason to buy en primeur, and that's the rule. So I think that when, like in 14, quality is very good, almost a great vintage, but not that outstanding vintage, I think the price has to be a sensible one. And it's always that matter of trying to generate interest, because, and with 14 more probably than ever, because a lot of people are questioning the interest of buying en primeur. So even if, once again, for the first growth, there has practically always, every year, been either a great or but at least some interest in buying en primeur. But I think in those conditions, we know that the price has to be sensible. I mean, we need to generate interest, of course, from the consumer.
Fair enough. So linked to that too, how would you score Château Margaux out of 20? Which is, again, an absurd question, but we're going to ask it anyway. How would you score it out of 20 at this stage?
Well, it's obviously a difficult question, because all scoring depends on how you usually give those scores. For example, in the French schools, teachers are always extremely difficult. So if you do extremely well, you might score 16 or 17, never 20, because they would hate you to believe that you are so good. So and the American scoring system is a bit more sensible, the A, B, C, D, and I think 40 is not A, because A is 09 and 10, but I think it's a B. So on scoring of 20, maybe it's not 18, 19, but it might be 17.
Wonderful answer. Wonderful answer. Paul Pontallier, Château Margaux,
Well,
thank you.
Adam, thank you. Thank you.